The air conditioning cut out first, then the emergency light flickered on, throwing long, nervous shadows across the polished steel elevator walls. We weren't just stuck. We were isolated, 15 floors above the city, and the silence was suffocating. Julian Hayes, the CEO of the entire corporation, normally a mountain of detached professionalism, leaned his head back against the wall, his breath ragged. We had been alone in this box for maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour when he met my gaze. "Amelia," he whispered, and the name on his lips felt like a transgression. "I think about you when I'm supposed to be signing multi-million-dollar deals." My stomach plummeted. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the forbidden proximity of a truth neither of us was supposed to acknowledge, certainly not 5 feet from the main lobby. My official title was Executive Assistant to the Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Sterling. That meant my life was defined by structure, checklists, and making sure the chaos of high finance never touched my boss's pristine calendar. My own life, Amelia Reynolds' life, was meticulously boring. I was 29, lived in a small, impeccably organized apartment in the suburbs, and my biggest excitement for the evening was usually deciding between microwaving frozen lasagna or ordering takeout from the Thai place that knew my name and my order by heart. I was not the kind of person who got stuck in elevators with the CEO, not the kind of person Julian Hayes noticed, let alone thought about, during critical business negotiations. I was part of the background hum of the corporation, the quiet efficiency that kept the gears turning. My routine was my fortress. I woke up at 6:00 a.m., had 2 cups of black coffee, and was at my desk by 7:30 a.m., an hour before anyone else. This quiet time was essential. It was when I felt most in control, most capable. I enjoyed the predictability. It was a stark contrast to the small, unaddressed emotional vacuums in my personal life. I didn't date much anymore. The energy required to explain myself, my quiet life, my complete lack of dramatic ambition, always seemed disproportionate to the outcome. It was easier to be alone, to avoid the inevitable disappointment that I wasn't the kind of woman a man stayed for. I worked on the 14th floor, the executive floor. Julian Hayes' office was the penthouse suite, the 30th floor, an entirely different orbit. I sometimes saw him in the parking garage, always immaculate, usually on a call, his dark suit jacket draped perfectly over his shoulders. He was an object of corporate admiration, a man who built empires before he hit 40. He was the kind of person you watched from a distance, understanding inherently that your worlds did not intersect. This afternoon, however, had been slightly off schedule. Mr. Sterling had needed an urgent printout of a revised budget for a meeting on the 30th floor. I volunteered, naturally. I always volunteered. It was easier than sitting still. I took the express elevator up, handed the folder to his PA, and was heading back down when Julian stepped in on 28. He didn't look at me, just nodded curtly, already looking tired beneath the veneer of power. The elevator was huge, made to fit 20 people comfortably, and we were the only 2. The air felt thin, professionally sterile, and completely safe. That safety dissolved when the lights died, when the car lurched and stopped, suspended between the 15th and 16th floors. I reached instinctively for the emergency call button, but Julian was faster, already trying the sequence to reset the system. He was working, even stuck in a box. I was just breathing too loudly, trying to look smaller, trying to become the invisible assistant I usually was, even though his confession was still ringing in my ears. I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened next would break the perfect, functional routine I had built my life upon. The reason Julian and I ended up in that specific elevator, at that specific time, was embarrassingly mundane. I had actually finished my work for Mr. Sterling 15 minutes earlier than usual. I had packaged my files, shut down my computer, and was ready to embrace the quiet predictability of my evening commute. I was already halfway down the corridor when I remembered the water bottle It wasn't even mine. It belonged to Liam, the intern on the 3rd floor, who had left a rather expensive customized thermos on my desk during a budget review meeting. I'd meant to give it to him earlier, but the afternoon had been a rush. I almost decided to leave it, to drop it off tomorrow, but a tiny, nagging voice of responsibility, the same one that made me triple-check all expense reports, pushed me back. It would only take 2 minutes. I pressed the up button again. Had I gone down a minute earlier, Julian Hayes would have caught the next car, or perhaps he would have taken the private executive lift. But because of Liam's forgotten thermos, I was there. I reached the 3rd floor, dropped the thermos off with a confused Liam, and returned to the main bank of elevators. That's when Julian stepped out of the 30th floor express, looking frustrated. "Is this lift heading down, Miss Reynolds?" he asked, not quite meeting my eyes, checking his watch impatiently. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, heading to the lobby." He gave a sharp nod and stepped in. He had probably just finished a grueling negotiation or a board meeting. The strain was visible around his jawline. I immediately pressed the button for my floor, the 14th, where I was picking up my bag, and the lobby. I stood stiffly at the back corner, trying to mentally project an aura of complete non-existence. This was a professional transport, not an opportunity for networking, and certainly not a moment for intimate observation. We rode in silence for a few floors. The canned elevator music, some light classical arrangement, was the only sound. I was focused on the numbers ticking down, calculating exactly how quickly I could exit, retrieve my purse, and be on the train home. I was thinking about the documentary I was planning to watch, the one about the mating habits of Arctic foxes. That was the height of my expected drama. Then came the jolt. It wasn't violent, just a decisive clunk. The lights flickered, died completely, and then the sickly yellow emergency bulbs kicked in. The music stopped mid-note, leaving a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. We stood in the unnatural silence. Julian instinctively reached for the emergency panel, his movement sharp and practiced. I felt a nervous giggle bubble up. It was the ridiculous anticlimax of it all, stuck in an elevator of all places. He tried the panel, pushing a few sequences. Nothing. He stepped back, running a hand through his immaculately styled dark hair, a rare moment of visible frustration. He was breathing heavily, less due to physical exertion and more due to the sudden lack of control. That's when he looked at me, really looked, and delivered the confession that shattered my carefully constructed sense of normalcy. It wasn't fate. It was a forgotten water bottle and an out-of-order lift. It was purely circumstantial, and that made it terrifying. Julian Hayes existed on a different plane of existence. When I described him to friends, which I rarely did, I didn't talk about his looks, though he was objectively handsome in that sharp, uncompromising way of men who spent more time in boardrooms than beaches. I talked about his gravitational pull. He didn't walk into a room, he anchored it. Everything and everyone shifted around his presence. At 38, he was the youngest CEO in the firm's history, a legacy builder who carried the weight of thousands of employees on his shoulders. He was money, status, and impenetrable control personified. Standing there, in the cramped, yellow light of the stalled elevator. He was still all those things, but the edges were frayed. He wore a tailor-made charcoal suit, the fabric expensive and smooth, but the knot of his tie was slightly loosened, an act of rebellion I'd never witnessed. His typical expression, a mask of confident, almost arrogant calm, was replaced by a flicker of sheer, unadulterated annoyance. When he looked at me and said my name, the sound of it was jarring, like a chord struck on a piano that had been silent for years. Amelia. Not Miss Reynolds, the name he used in the few necessary exchanges we had. I remember thinking, even as the shock was paralyzing me, how utterly alien he was to my life. My dates were accountants and IT specialists. My social circle consisted of women who understood the stress of monthly budgets and the lure of a quiet Saturday night. Julian Hayes lived in the penthouse of a glass tower downtown, attended global economic summits, and probably had his dry cleaning delivered by a different person every week. He was the sun, and I was a distant, minor moon, merely orbiting the periphery of his corporate galaxy. "Mr. Hayes, we should call building services again," I managed, my voice thin, desperate to inject routine back into the moment. He ignored my suggestion, his gaze fixed, piercing through the professional veneer I desperately clung to. He didn't move towards me. He didn't need to. The small space made the distance irrelevant. His power wasn't physical. It was the authority in his voice, and the sheer impossibility of what he had just admitted. "Did you hear me, Amelia?" He pressed, the sound low, almost dangerous. His eyes, a startling shade of pale gray, were usually guarded, calculating. Now, they were wide open, and I saw something akin to fatigue, not just physical, but soul-deep. He was the definition of off-limits. He was the CEO. I was an assistant 3 tiers below him, whose greatest professional aspiration was a small raise and a slightly bigger window view. The entire corporate handbook stood between us, a thick volume of rules and hierarchy. Yet here we were, suspended between 2 worlds, and he was shattering the cardinal rule: never bring the personal into the professional. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat making my next response difficult. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that whatever happened when the doors opened again, I would never look at Julian Hayes the same way. The image of the untouchable empire builder had cracked, revealing something messy and human underneath. The silence that followed his admission. "I think about you when I'm supposed to be signing multi-million-dollar deals," was thicker than the air in the stalled car. It was the kind of silence that held a promise and a threat, equally weighted. My heart, normally content with a steady, quiet rhythm, was now pounding a frantic, desperate beat against my ribs. I stared at the emergency panel, at the call button flashing uselessly, desperate for the mundane relief of an outside noise. "Mr. Hayes," I finally managed, my voice a breathy squeak. "I believe the heat is getting to us. We should focus on getting the technicians up here." I needed to frame this as environmental stress, a consequence of the technical failure. Anything but the truth. But his expression didn't change. He didn't blink. He just held my gaze, and I felt a wave of dizzying panic. Was I hallucinating? Was I projecting my own quiet, contained yearnings onto a man whose life was too vast and important for such petty distractions? "Amelia, please don't dismiss this as the heat," he said, his voice low and steady, pulling the rug out from under my attempt at rationalization. "We both know I am perfectly capable of maintaining my composure under pressure. And I am telling you, with the same clarity I used to discuss quarterly earnings, that you distract me." The word distract was an understatement. It was a corporate synonym for utter fascination, and hearing it directed at me felt like a betrayal of my own reality. I had worked hard to be unremarkable, efficient, and unmemorable. It was safer that way. I don't understand," I lied, the lie catching in my throat. I understood perfectly. It was the context that was impossible. He took a slow step towards me. The space between us shrunk, making my polite 4 feet of distance seem ridiculous. I didn't back away, mostly because my feet were suddenly bolted to the floor. The scent of his cologne, expensive, subtle cedar, finally reached me, cutting through the stale metallic air. "It started 6 months ago," he continued, as if reciting facts from a file he couldn't put down. "The way you hold yourself when you're waiting for Sterling outside his office. Patient, but somehow coiled. And the way you look at the city when you think no one is watching, right before you step into the elevator. It's a moment of profound quiet. like the world stops for you, just for a second. I saw it. My face flushed hot. He had observed me, not just passed me in the hallway, but actually cataloged my unconscious habits. The quiet moment I stole every afternoon by the window, my single rebellion against the structured day, was his secret knowledge. A flicker of genuine discomfort crossed his face then, not directed at me, but at the situation. I shouldn't be saying this. It's inappropriate. It's reckless. But we are stuck in a metal box, Amelia. And I feel like if I don't say it now, I might never have the courage again. He was confessing a weakness, not just an attraction, but a deep, disruptive distraction that was pulling him off course. And I realized, with a frightening clarity, that I wasn't overreacting. This wasn't a stress-induced fantasy. This was real, raw, emotional breaking point, happening between a CEO and his CFO's assistant, in a stopped elevator, 150 feet above the pavement. My defense mechanisms were crumbling. I was ready to argue the technical impossibility of his feelings, to remind him of the company policy, to pretend I hadn't spent the last 6 months trying very hard not to notice how well his suits fit, or the intensity of his hands when he gripped his phone. But his next words preempted any corporate protest I could muster. "Do you know what it's like?" Julian asked, his voice softer now, lacking its usual CEO steel. "To spend every single day making decisions that affect thousands of people, and yet feel completely unseen as a man, as a person." He didn't wait for an answer. He wasn't asking for professional pity. He was stating a fact of his isolation. He looked down at his shoes for a moment, an almost boyish gesture that stripped away the armor of his position. "Everyone sees the title, Amelia. They see the net worth. They see the structure, the control. They see the power. And they respond to that. They cater to it. They fear it, or they try to leverage it. No one," he lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine again, "no one just sees Julian." I felt a sudden, profound shift. The power dynamic hadn't inverted socially. He was still the CEO stuck in an elevator, and I was still the assistant. But emotionally, the scales tilted drastically. He had just handed me the heaviest piece of himself, his loneliness. He was admitting that his empire was also his cage. "I see the pressure, Mr. Hayes," I said, the formality of the address coming out of habit, not distance. "It's visible. You work through lunch most days. You're the last person to leave the 30th floor." A shadow of a smile, melancholic and quick, crossed his lips. "You notice that?" "It's my job to observe the executive floor schedules," I replied, but the professionalism sounded thin, even to my own ears. "No, Amelia. It's your job to track Sterling's calendar. You observe me." He took another careful step, closing the gap until we were standing almost too close for comfort, but the discomfort was now laced with an unbearable tenderness. He sighed, the sound heavy, weighted with genuine exhaustion. "The moment I saw you looking out the window, that quiet second of peace you stole, I thought, she is the only person here who doesn't want something from me. You want silence. You want an escape, just for a moment. And I realized, that's all I want too." His admission wasn't about sex or corporate scandal. It was about shared emotional fatigue. He wasn't seducing me. He was exposing a raw, aching need for authenticity. The figure of the untouchable CEO dissolved, replaced by a man standing under a harsh emergency light, exhausted by the very success that defined him. For the first time, I wasn't intimidated by his status. I felt protective of his vulnerability. The emergency phone on the panel crackled to life, a sudden, sharp sound. A technician's voice, muffled and distorted, assured us they were working on the motor, and that we should remain calm. Julian waved a hand dismissively towards the panel, signaling that the corporate protocol was now secondary to the conversation. He moved to the small bench built into the elevator wall and sat down, leaning his forearms on his knees, his posture open and unconstrained. It was a completely different Julian Hayes from the one who chaired the board meetings. I hesitated, then sat beside him. The metallic bench was cold against the back of my legs, but the proximity to him was generating its own nervous heat. The minutes stretched, slow and thick. We didn't talk about work or status or the inconvenience of being stuck. We talked about small, insignificant things that felt enormous in that confined space. "What do you do when you finally get home, Amelia?" he asked, not prying, just genuinely curious. I felt safe enough to be honest. "I usually make tea, turn off all the electronic notifications, and read a book, or sometimes I just sit on the balcony and watch the city lights." He smiled, a genuine, relaxed tilt of his lips that changed the whole structure of his face. No parties, no lavish dinners. I always assume everyone who works here is constantly buzzing like me. "I like quiet," I admitted. "My job requires constant anticipation of needs. At home, I just want zero anticipation." "Me too," he confessed. "My apartment is mostly glass and silence. I have a view that spans the entire state, but sometimes I just stare at the concrete wall of the building opposite mine. It's less demanding." There was a moment then, a shared breath between us, that was profoundly comfortable. We weren't a CEO and an assistant anymore. We were two adults sharing a secret, mundane truth about the weariness of modern life. He started talking about growing up on a farm, a detail so far removed from his current image that it was almost unbelievable. He spoke of the heavy smell of damp earth after a rainstorm and the unrelenting quiet of the fields. I listened, captivated, tracing the outline of my own name etched into the steel by some previous board occupant. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was simply sharing history. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, smooth river stone, worn white. "My father gave me this when I left for college," he said, turning it over in his large, capable hand. "A reminder that even the strongest currents shape things eventually." He placed the stone back in his pocket, and the gesture felt significant. It was a physical representation of his vulnerability, presented openly, not just to me, but for me. The lack of demands, the absence of agenda. It created a space where the connection was clean, unburdened by expectation. It was simply real. I didn't need a promise from him. The truth of his presence was enough. As Julian spoke about his life before the suits and the global travel, a chilling awareness began to settle over me. The truth he was sharing felt like a precious, fragile thing, but the reality outside this metal box was harsh and unforgiving. We were still Amelia Reynolds, executive assistant, and Julian Hayes, CEO. My mind started racing, cataloging all the reasons why this intimacy was impossible, foolish, and deeply dangerous. If anyone, especially Mr. Sterling, who had an almost parental protectiveness over corporate decorum, were to find out, my functional, predictable life would shatter. I liked my job. I needed my income. More than that, I needed the respect that came with being seen as competent and professional. If I pursued this, even mentally, I risked all of it. I would become that assistant, the subject of whispers and speculation, defined by my association with power, not my own merit. Julian had exposed his loneliness, but his life would continue largely unchanged. He was too big to fail because of a dalliance with a lower-tier employee. But I was not. I was expendable. I pulled my knees up to my chest, subtly trying to rebuild the barrier that had dissolved when I sat next to him. "Julian," I started, using his first name for the first time, testing the sound of it, feeling the weight of the informality. He looked at me instantly, recognizing the shift. This conversation, this moment, it can't leave this elevator. My voice was firm, laced with fear. I wasn't rejecting him. I was protecting myself. I was protecting the tiny, perfect bubble of quiet I had constructed over the years. I couldn't afford to be reckless. I was scared that the minute the power came back on, this connection would feel like a cheap trick of circumstance, a fleeting intimacy born of danger, and I would be left alone, exposed, having risked everything for a confession that meant nothing outside of this cage. "I know the rules, Amelia," he said, his voice dropping, recognizing the unspoken context of hierarchy and scandal. "Believe me, I live by them. They are the only thing that keeps the structure from collapsing. But they are also why I'm sitting here, telling a near stranger things I wouldn't tell my own board members." He didn't apologize for his feelings, and that was the most potent thing about his confession. He simply acknowledged the risk. "I need you to understand," I continued, pressing the point, "that if the doors open and we walk out, it has to be erased. We can't complicate things. I respect my position too much to jeopardize it, and I respect you too much to put you in a position that compromises the company." It felt like a monumental act of self-denial. My body was humming with the possibility he presented, but my mind was counting the costs. I wanted to lean my head on his shoulder and ask him to stop being the CEO, just for 5 more minutes. Instead, I was drawing the line, reinforcing the cage we both inhabited. I looked at him, waiting for the corporate nod, the controlled acceptance of my boundary. I needed him to be the boss again, to make the emotional retreat easy. But he didn't. He just held my gaze, his own filled with a frustrating mix of understanding and defiance. Julian Hayes listened to my carefully constructed defense, my reliance on corporate rules and self-preservation, and he didn't argue. He didn't try to negotiate or minimize the reality of the risk. He simply acknowledged every layer of the obstacle I had just laid out. He reached out and gently took my hand, not as a lover, but as someone seeking to anchor himself. His skin was warm against mine, a startling contact that made my breathing hitch. I watched his face as he prepared to speak, seeing the effort it took for him to push past the layers of control he lived within. "You want me to tell you that when these doors open, we'll both reset," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, almost reverent murmur. "You want me to be the CEO again and let you be the invisible assistant. You want me to promise that the rules matter more than what we just shared." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with the conflict between my fear and the surging desire to throw caution away. He tightened his grip on my hand, his thumb tracing a small circle over my knuckles. It was a simple, non-aggressive gesture, but it held the weight of an ultimatum. "I can't promise that, Amelia," he stated, his pale gray eyes unflinching. "Because I've tried. For 6 months, I have tried to make you disappear into the background noise of this company, and I can't. You are the only thing that makes the noise stop." He leaned closer, the intensity of his gaze overwhelming the confined space. This was the moment of truth, the phrase I would carry with me, whether the doors opened or not. It wasn't about the job, or the elevator, or the hierarchy. It was about fundamental recognition. "I don't desire an assistant, Amelia," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I don't want a distraction. I don't want a risk. I want you, not the capable employee, but the woman who steals 5 minutes of silence by the window every afternoon." He paused, letting the magnitude of the statement sink in. My pulse was throbbing in my ears. "I see how careful you are, how you anticipate every disaster, how you always choose the safe, predictable path," he continued. "But the safe path is lonely, isn't it? I know that loneliness, and I am tired of it. I don't want to break the rules, but I refuse to ignore the only true thing that has happened to me in years, simply because it's inconvenient." He released my hand, but the imprint of his touch remained, searing. His final words were delivered with a courage I never expected from the guarded man of finance. "I don't know what we are, or what we could be, but I choose to see you. I choose the risk. And I am asking you, now that we are outside of time, to stop hiding from me, just for a moment." He hadn't asked me to leave my job or to profess love. He had simply asked me to stop hiding. That request, simple and devastating, was the true climax. My silence was not refusal. It was the noise of my internal walls crashing down. I felt profoundly afraid, not of Julian, but of the disruption he represented. I was looking at a man who was offering to share his complicated, impossible life with me, and the temptation to step into the chaos was overwhelming. My eyes burned with unshed tears, purely from the shock of being chosen. I had spent so long being the reliable fixture, the pleasant, easy presence that required nothing, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be someone's singular focus. "I am terrified, Julian," I admitted, the words barely a rasp. I didn't try to sugarcoat the emotion or feign confidence. I offered him the same raw honesty he had given me. "I have built my life around being safe. Every choice, every routine, it's about avoiding this kind of risk. The fall is longer for me than it is for you." He didn't flinch at my fear. He seemed to respect it. "I know," he replied simply. "And I don't want you to fall. I want you to step toward me, with your eyes open, knowing exactly what we're defying." The air conditioner sputtered back to life, a sudden, cold rush of air that signaled the impending end of our isolation. The emergency lights dimmed slightly as the main power attempted to cycle on. The spell was breaking. We had seconds, maybe a minute, before the world rushed back in. I looked at him, really seeing the deep lines of stress etched around his eyes, the vulnerability he had allowed me to witness. He wasn't a corporate fantasy. He was a lonely man whose life of control had become unsustainable. And he saw me, the quiet woman who had given up on expecting anything grand. "I won't pretend this is safe or smart or even possible," I confessed, my hand trembling slightly as I lifted it to nervously push my hair back. "But I can't deny that everything you just said felt more real than anything I've felt in years. I can't walk out of here and pretend this didn't happen, because you saw me." That was my choice. Not an agreement to a relationship, but a refusal to erase the recognition. I was choosing to validate the truth of the moment, even if it led to inevitable complications. "Then don't erase it," he urged, his voice heavy with relief. "Just hold on to it." The main lights flickered on, blazing white and sudden. The sterile chime of the elevator resuming its service sounded deafening. We had stalled between the 15th and 16th floors. Now we dropped smoothly down to the 14th. The doors began to slide open, revealing the polished marble floor of the executive reception area. Time rushed back in. Julian Hayes was instantly the CEO again. Composed, formidable, his mask back in place. But his eyes, those pale gray windows, held a silent, intense question, waiting for my final confirmation. The doors fully opened. The world, bright and loud, rushed in. Julian and I stood up simultaneously, the movement stiff, rehearsed. He stepped out first, naturally, the leader emerging from the crisis. The security guards who had rushed to the area looked relieved to see him. "Thank you, gentlemen," Julian said, his voice crisp and authoritative, already addressing the structural issue, minimizing the disturbance. "Just a temporary outage. The system needs a full diagnostic." He turned back slightly, waiting for me. I stepped out onto the marble floor, retrieving my purse from the executive desk. We weren't speaking, but the air between us was vibrating with the unspoken history of the last half hour. The professional masks were on, but we both knew they were thin, transparent. As we walked toward the main lobby exit, the distance between us was strictly appropriate, about 2 feet, but it felt impossibly close. He maintained a pace that suggested urgency, but it wasn't frantic. It was a controlled exit. "Amelia," he said, without looking at me, his gaze fixed on the double glass doors ahead. His voice was low enough that only I could hear. I need to travel to London tomorrow morning. It's unavoidable, but I don't want the door to close on this. I kept my eyes on the floor, watching the reflection of the lobby lights. It shouldn't be open, Julian. We both know that. But it is, he countered, the simple statement carrying immense conviction. He reached the exit doors and paused, letting a few people stream past us. He didn't touch me, but the sheer force of his presence was an anchor. I need you to send me an email tonight. Not about the budget, not about Sterling's calendar, just a single sentence. Something you want, Amelia. Something you would never write in an inter-office memo. My breath caught. It was a safe way to cross the boundary, a clandestine communication that risked nothing physical, but risked everything emotionally. It was a demand for truth in the form of a request. He finally turned, meeting my gaze one last time before stepping out into the evening traffic. I will wait for that email, and I will call you from London. You have my number. Use it. He didn't wait for a response. He simply walked through the glass doors, disappearing into the dark, hurried chaos of the city, leaving me standing in the cool, echoing lobby. He was gone, but the atmosphere of control he normally inhabited was now utterly destabilized. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, but inside, my entire world had shifted on its axis. I knew I couldn't write the email about the Arctic foxes. I had to write the truth. And the truth felt monumental. What happens when the line between your career and your heart is erased by a 40-minute power failure? Will Amelia risk her stable, predictable life for the exhausting, forbidden truth Julian offered? Find out what Amelia typed in that single-sentence email and whether Julian broke his entire life for her by subscribing now. Don't let this story get lost in the feed. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of The CEO's Secret.